Hello everyone, it looks like we are ready to get started. I hope that you guys had a great weekend and that you had all of your work turned in yesterday by 11:59 p.m. If you happen to not get everything done by 11:59 p.m., I have left the exam where you can still take that today. So if you didn't get that finished, please go ahead and do that today. You also have the option, if you so prefer, to use exam 3 as your drop exam and go ahead and take that 4th exam next week. But it's whatever you would prefer. So just to kind of pick up and let you guys know where we're at, we're going into week 7 right now. This will be our last week of lectures. In week 7, something that's a little bit different is you do have 3 chapters. So your final exam will only be over chapters 16, 17, and 18. We will cover chapter 16 today and chapter 17 on Thursday, but you will need to look over chapter 18 on your own. Now, if you are happy with your grade after I get those exams graded and curved today, you do not have to take the final exam. That can be your drop exam. You will need to go ahead and do chapter 16's inquisitive assignment. Again, I give you participation grades once you've done one inquisitive. So for week 7, you'll only need to do chapter 16. Then you will receive credit for chapters 17 and 18. Even if you don't plan on taking the final, I would highly recommend that you do go ahead and look over these chapters and attend the lectures, as it is really important information. Just because it will be a drop exam and things like that doesn't mean that it's not important. So please go ahead and take some time to do that. Also, just kind of, show of hands, so to speak, of those of you that are on. If you'll please go ahead and let me know if you plan on taking the final. I realize you might not know completely yet since you're waiting on me to get those grades updated today. But if you plan on taking the final or you don't plan on taking the final, please go ahead and type that in the comment box. And I'll give you guys just 1 second to do that, and then we'll go ahead and move on a little bit. Okay, I see Jessica's comment came in that she does not plan to take the final. Hopefully a lot of you won't plan on taking the final. That is kind of the goal of this class, is to not have you have to take a final. But if you do have to take the final, don't fear about that. It will be pretty good for you. It is only over 3 chapters, but you still do have the same amount of time that you've had on all of the other exams. So it might be actually a bit easier for you than some of the other exams have been. Mario said that he's still debating. That's fine too. Now, even if you're happy with your grade and you feel like you don't need to take the final, you can always take it. If you do horrible, it'll just be the drop grade anyway. You may do better than you have on previous exams, but I know a lot of you that have been attending the streams and things like that. You're doing so well in this class, and honestly, I am so impressed with you guys. Even with, switching to an online class when that wasn't something you signed up for, you all have actually done better on average than most of my in-class students typically do. So, pat yourselves on the back. You guys are so impressive and you've been so engaged in the discussion. So I really do appreciate that. Just one more reminder, this participation discussion board, you do still need to go ahead and do that. So remember, because we can't take attendance like we normally would in an on-campus class, this participation article forum is where 10% of your grade comes from. So make sure to get that participation article completed. It's a very easy assignment, and as long as you do it, you will get 100. So please go ahead and get that done. I see Eric said exam 3 with a question mark. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. If you're asking about grades, I will have exam 3 graded by the end of today. So pretty much as soon as we get off of this video, I'm going to go ahead and get those grades updated. That way you'll know exactly where you stand. And I'll go ahead and update the participation grades as well to give you a good idea of, where you're at and if you need to go ahead and take that final. So thank you. Great question. Now, other than the participation discussion, I just wanted to kind of reiterate one more time. In week 8, the only thing that you will have is that final exam. So if you're not taking your final and you're happy after you do chapter 16 inquisitive, then you are finished with this class. You're so close to being done. If you are going to take that final, please keep in mind it is due on Thursday, May 21st. So typically, as we all know, our assignments are due on Monday nights, but because I do have to post final grades, that exam has to be due on that Thursday, and I can't extend that at all. So there's no wiggle room on my end. I wish I could, but it's just not something that we have the luxury of doing. So if there's no more questions about kind of generic things, I'm going to go ahead and move into the PowerPoint for today. So chapter 16 covers fiscal policy. This is something that we've been kind of building up to. We've talked a little bit about fiscal policy, how there are monetary policies and different types and things like that, but we'll get into the more kind of intricate aspects of that today. So what do you think, whenever we go to war, do you think that going to war would be considered expansionary or contractionary policy? So whenever we're talking about fiscal policy, expansionary policy is meant to expand the government to stimulate the government, and contractionary policy is meant to kind of slow down the government, slow down our GDP and things like that to get a handle on inflation. So what do you think war would be considered? Would that be considered expansionary or contractionary? I'll give you guys a second to think about that and go ahead and post your answer in the comments, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. So I see Eric said expansionary. Jessica also said expansionary. That's kind of typically what a lot of people would answer. You know, we think about war as, you know, increasing military spending, which would be, you know, expansionary policy, obviously. But the role of war, obviously, is not as simple as being a fiscal policy. Spending on war is not usually going to be defined as fiscal policy. Fiscal policy in itself is defined as policy that's intended to affect the economy. So yes, military spending will have an expansionary effect on the economy, so the same effect as an expansionary fiscal policy. But it's still important to kind of make that distinction that war in itself is not meant to be any type of fiscal policy, but it does behave in the same way as expansionary policy. So wonderful answers. Thank you. Now, the big questions for this chapter, we want to answer what is fiscal policy, what are some shortcomings of fiscal policy, and what is supply side fiscal policy. So these are all, there's really no crazy new math in this chapter or anything like that. It's really more conceptual, and it should feel pretty familiar to you because we've actually already talked about fiscal policy a lot this semester, just without giving it that exact name. So how does fiscal policy work? Well, we have monetary policy and we have fiscal policy. Now with monetary policy, we're using that money supply to influence the economy. So we're either increasing or decreasing that monetary supply or the money supply. Fiscal policy, this is when the government spending and taxes are adjusted to influence the economy. Now fiscal policy is a little different because this has to be legislated and approved by Congress and the president. You can imagine how hard that can be to get everyone to agree on those terms. And it can be used with or instead of monetary policy. So fiscal policy can be enacted by itself, or we can combine it with some monetary policy actions to go ahead and achieve our desired result, hopefully. Now, within fiscal policy, we have expansional and contractional policy. So expansionary fiscal policy, this is when the government increases their spending or decreases taxes to stimulate and expand the economy. So think about what's going on right now. Do you think that it's likely that they're doing expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy right now? With contractionary fiscal policy, the government's decreasing their spending or they're raising taxes to try to slow down the economy. They pay off government debt, and this can also keep the economy from expanding beyond the long-run capabilities. So do you think that right now, do you think that what's going on is expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy? And yes, Eric, with differing parties in play, it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to pass fiscal policies because, no, as we've seen, apparently we can't just all get along. So I'll give you all a second to answer with what's going on right now. Is it expansionary or contractionary? And we're talking like stimulus checks, the CARES Act. So the economy is contracting right now, but not because of the policy. The policy that they're enacting is trying to kind of do the opposite of that. So whenever they send out stimulus checks to people or they give breaks on interest rates, yeah, there you go, Jessica, you caught it. It would be expansionary because they're trying to kind of pump life into the economy. They're trying to encourage people to spend to kind of combat those negative connotations that we're feeling towards like our current economic state. So they're absolutely trying to expand and use expansionary fiscal policy right now. Now, there's a couple of different intricacies here. With traditional demand-focused fiscal policy, this is what politicians look toward to counteract the business cycle. That's kind of what stimulus checks are and what the CARES Act is and things like that. When the economy starts to slow down, the prescription for that is expansionary fiscal policy. So they'll increase government spending, i.e. sending out aid to various citizens and things like that, or they'll decrease taxes. So you might see a decrease on your taxes this year as they try to kind of combat that. Now, increasing government spending is going to increase that aggregate demand because we know that G, government spending, is one component of that aggregate demand function. Decreasing our taxes raises the disposable income that we have and also raises the consumption that we'll kind of partake in. And this also is going to increase aggregate demand in our overall GDP. On the other end of that coin, contractionary fiscal policy is going to be used when the government really wants to just pay off debt or slow down what they call an overheated economy. So we know that rapid growth is often really unsustainable and fueled by debt. So sometimes we have to kind of pump the brakes and slow down the economy. The goal is to increase aggregate demand to move the economy to full employment equilibrium, so that Y that we've been looking at, where real GDP is at that full unemployment level and the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate. It's more likely and more common that expansionary fiscal policy is occurring. It's not as likely or common for contractionary policy to be enacted because we don't typically experience those kind of uninhibited growth periods. We're very steady in our GDP growth. So what's going on right now with the expansionary policy, that's kind of a more common side effect. All right, so this is figure 16.1 from your book, and we're going to kind of look at what this looks like graphically. So we have our real GDP, which is Y, on this x-axis. We have our price level on the y-axis, and we have our long-run aggregate supply curve right here. And we have that, Y prime, which is that full employment, and U is equal to the U prime, which is the natural rate of unemployment. And you can see here, A is that equilibrium point, so we have aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply. All of those things are kind of meeting at that perfect point. Now, suppose that we have a decrease in aggregate demand from AD1 to this new AD2 curve that just came up. The economy is now at a short-run equilibrium point, so that's this little lowercase b right here. And what's happening here is that our employment is below that full employment number, and our actual unemployment is going to be higher than that natural rate of unemployment. So this is kind of not a good scenario to be right here. Think whenever everyone kind of started to notice that this COVID thing was a problem and people started to become furloughed or become nervous that they would be furloughed. So people stop spending, and that's when aggregate demand decreases. So that would be a really good example of what would lead us to this AD2 point. Now, we don't want to end up below that kind of sustainable long-run aggregate supply. So there is something that they'll have to do to fix that. You can see that in the long run, prices are going to adjust if we do nothing, and we're going to move back to that full employment equilibrium, which would be point C. So this is if they did nothing at all. We just wait for the long run. Prices are going to adjust to be lower than expected. So we're down here, we go all the way down to 90. And this is going to take time. And we know, and a lot of you are currently experiencing, that whenever a recession starts to happen, the hardship is really significant. And sometimes just waiting for things to naturally sort of progress from A to B and back to C, it's not a luxury that we have. So this is why policymakers can choose to use expansionary fiscal policy to go ahead and shift aggregate demand back to that 81 over here and not wait for this kind of long cycle to occur. Government officials could do this by increasing their government spending or decreasing our taxes. And a successful policy would bring us all the way back to A. So the goal of policy is not to get us to C faster. The goal of the policy is to get us back to A, to that kind of optimal and original point. So the goal of countercyclical fiscal policy is to shift aggregate demand back to that original aggregate demand curve so that the economy is back at full employment without waiting for those long-run adjustments. So remember, whenever we have capital letters on these graphs, these are long-run equilibrium points. Whenever we have lowercase letters, this is a short-run equilibrium. So rather than waiting from long run to short run back to a lower long run, we want to get back to that original long-run equilibrium. So the Great Recession and some fiscal policy that happened during that, the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008. In response to the poor economic conditions that were happening during the Great Recession, the government went ahead and enacted two pretty significant fiscal policy initiatives. The Economic Stimulus Act was signed by President George W. Bush in February of 2008. And the primary purpose of this act was to provide a tax rebate for Americans on 2007 taxes. So the government physically mailed partial tax refund checks to citizens in the amount of $1,800, which was for a 4-person family, $600 per adult, and $300 per child. And the cost of this to the government was approximately $168 billion. So about one of every $7 paid in the 2007 individual income taxes. And theory would suggest here that most of the $168 billion that was returned to taxpayers would then be spent as opposed to saved and increase that aggregate demand and stimulate the economy. However, after this first fiscal stimulus was passed, economic conditions actually got worse. So think about that. They sent people $1,800 partial tax refund checks, so think stimulus check, basically. And they thought that people would automatically go out and spend this money. They thought that this would make aggregate demand increase, that this would improve the conditions. But economic conditions actually got worse. So why do you think that might have happened? And there's not like a wrong answer here. This is just kind of a matter of your opinion. Why do you think that this didn't work? Yeah, so Eric, you kind of nailed it right on the head there. You said not much money was spent, and that was true. So, not to get into your personal finances or anything like that, but think about the current stimulus checks if you got one, and think, a lot of people did have to use that money to pay off bills, but a lot of people probably didn't go out and just spend that money right away for a couple of reasons. One being a lot of things are closed. Another being that people are nervous, so they're saving. If they can save, if they have the ability to save, they're saving that money. Jessica said that she was going to guess that the $1,800 was not enough for a family of 4. That could have been a big part of it too, because a lot of times by the time that a fiscal policy is enacted and then the money actually gets to the people, if a recession is very serious, then people are already behind. And getting $1,800 or $2,000 or whatever you may get in a stimulus check, it might just not be enough. So very good answers. So this actually just made everything worse. After that, Barack Obama was elected in the 2008 presidential election, and this shifted the party power in Washington. And in February 2009, Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So this was the second policy of the Great Recession. This bill aimed at expansionary fiscal policy again, but the focus was on government spending as opposed to taxes. So remember, the last bill, the last act gave a tax kind of refund, and this bill is focused more on government spending. So in addition to this, the size of the ARRA, which is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, was a lot larger than the Economic Stimulus Act. 70% of the cost of this act was attributed to government spending, and the remaining 30% only went to tax credits. So while seemingly different, both of these packages had the goal of increasing aggregate demand. And kind of another point of having this in here is because Democrat, Republican, whatever, nobody that's in an office is saying, I want to do something that's going to make people worse off. Obviously, anytime that there's policy enacted, they're enacting that policy because they think at the time, with the information they have, that that's going to be kind of the best course of action. Now, we've seen from both of these that it doesn't always work out that way. And we'll talk about why it doesn't always work out a little bit more as we move on in the chapter. So this is figure 16.2 from your book. The two historical fiscal policy initiatives that we talked about illustrate the tools of fiscal policy, so taxes and spending. The first, that was enacted in February 2008, focused on taxes, so a refund of taxes that had previously been paid in. And the second, passed a year later, focused on government spending. So they may seem very different, but theoretically they're very similar. Both of them were aimed at aggregate demand and increasing aggregate demand. And this is just kind of graphically showing you what happened with that real GDP growth rate and the unemployment rate. And you can see unemployment still continued to rise during both of these. And that real GDP, it did start to recover. So this was about whenever that first act was enacted, we saw a little jump and then a big decrease. The second act steadily started to improve things with real GDP. This is when the first act was enacted. You can see unemployment still went up quite a bit. There were elections, Obama takes office, the second act passes, and then you can see unemployment still went up pretty heavily for the next couple of months. So even though we're trying our best to do what's going to be the best for everyone, it doesn't always work that way. So which of the following would be an example of expansionary fiscal policy? Very good. Jessica said B. Eric also said B. That is a stimulus package. Lots of B's coming in here. Hopefully this is one, you know, as crappy as everything is right now, at least it's going to help you with your economics because we're kind of living through this right now. So great answers. Thank you. Now, deficits and debt. Let's go ahead and pop up the slide for you. When an economy is in a recession, usually the government is going to try to stimulate the economy by increasing government spending, decreasing taxes, or both. We know that. Now, recall that during a recession, there's going to be a natural decrease in tax revenues as people's incomes are going down. So they're not going to be spending as much, they're not going to be taxed as much, that kind of thing. But where does the government get the money to increase government spending or to fund tax rebates? Well, usually they'll sell treasury bills to go ahead and fill those gaps in the budget. And this is basically the government's form of borrowing, as they're going to have to pay back these bonds later. Expansionary fiscal policy is going to increase our deficit and debt during our recession. So while they're trying to pump that money into the economy and decrease taxes and things like that, the government's actually going further into debt. And that's because that money has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is going to be borrowing. This is figure 16.3. So using expansionary fiscal policy to counteract economic downturns is going to increase our debts and our deficits as our outlays increase during those recessionary periods. So the budget surplus was erased in 2001 as a result of some of these policies. So we have this blue line right here that is government revenues, and the orange line is going to be our spending. So outlays is spending. And you can see that our outlays or spending is typically going to be higher than our revenues because we typically operate at a deficit. Now, we have sometimes little periods where our revenue is greater than our deficit. It's often very short-lived. But you can see that around 2001, when we had to start enacting some of these policies, and then as the recessions happened, our kind of deficit gap got bigger as revenue was quite lower than our outlays or spending. Moving on, a little more on debts and deficits. Let me go ahead and pop this up. So another reason that spending works, according to the Keynesian model, is that the fiscal policy theory persists that increased spending is going to help return the economy to full employment. The increase in employment is going to increase revenues, and Keynes says that the quicker we can get back to full employment with more tax revenues paid in compared to unemployment, the better. Typically, on an individual level, we really wouldn't expect individuals to spend whenever unemployment is high. People get nervous, they're going to save their money. However, on the macroeconomic level, spending by one person generates income for another. So think about that. When you go and you spend money, you're, paying someone's wages, supporting someone's small business, that kind of thing. So this is going to result in the multiplier effect, and as that process continues. And we'll talk more about what the multiplier is as we get a little bit further into this chapter. But basically, it's kind of like that little ripple that starts a massive tsunami, right? It's as people start to spend more and more people are getting income, and then things start to improve. Now, on the other end of that, we have contractionary fiscal policy. So debt incurred during deficits has to be paid off sometimes, and it can be paid off when the economy turns around and begins expanding. That's the countercyclical fiscal policy prescription. Budget deficits during contractions and budget surpluses during expansions. So in theory, debt is paid off during good economic times so that it's not a significant problem in the future. An example here, the US government ran budget surpluses from 1998 to 2001 at the end of an extended economic expansion. However, national debt did increase during this time, but was not eliminated completely. Did decrease during this time, but we weren't able to eliminate that completely. So the highest level of sustainable output in the long run, we've seen that before. That's that full employment output, that Y prime that we see on all these graphs. It's possible for output to be above that Y prime if the unemployment drops below the natural rate, or that U prime. However, this level is not sustainable in the long run, and such high levels of aggregate demand can start to make inflation become a concern. And that's why we would start to work on enacting some sort of contractionary fiscal policy. So what that looks like, this is kind of to show you what that typically will look like. We have our original graph that we've seen a couple of times, but you can see here that our short-run equilibrium is actually above that long-run aggregate supply curve. In this case, we're at a higher than our natural level of employment, and unemployment is actually less than that natural rate. So that's kind of when we move over to the right a little bit too far here. Eventually, we would get back to point C over here, but we would have to shift aggregate demand back to the left. So at point A, which is that original thing that we were looking at here, remember that our real GDP is greater than our full employment output, and this is kind of over what is sustainable in the long run. There's upward pressure here. We can see that our price level is higher than 100. We're a little bit higher than where we would like to be. And there's two possible ways that the government could conduct this contractionary fiscal policy. So they could decrease their government spending, or they could increase taxes, which would lead to decreased consumption spending. Either way, they're going to go ahead and reduce that aggregate demand curve down so we can get to this point at B here, to that more sustainable equilibrium. And that's going to kind of start to shift those curves. So what would be an example of contractionary fiscal policy? And remember, if it's just dealing with the money supply, it's monetary policy. So we just are interested in things that are contractionary fiscal policy here. Very good. Eric said D. That is correct. Increasing taxes, because if they increase taxes, we have less disposable income, and therefore we spend less, and that can shift that aggregate demand curve over to the left. Let me go ahead and pop this slide up for you. Some more on countercyclical fiscal policy. So countercyclical policy is going to smooth out cycles, The goal here is decrease the size of expansions and recessions. The government uses this kind of policy to try to shift aggregate demand back to that long-run equilibrium faster. An economy that grows at a predictable rate is obviously going to be a lot more favorable than one that has a high variance. And this countercyclical policy is going to reduce the size and magnitude of those fluctuations. Now, the economic theory behind the fiscal policy in both 2008 and 2009 stems from the work of Keynes. And it all kind of comes from a book that he published that's called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. Remember his famous quote, "In the long run, we're all dead"? Basically, what he's saying is that we don't have time to wait around for these things to kind of fix themselves, that we do need policy intervention to smooth out those cycles and kind of decrease the fluctuations. All right, so this is table 16.1. This is a great tool to keep for your exams. It basically just kind of breaks down what's going on at the different sort of policy ideas and things like that. So absolutely make a note. This is slide 18 to use this for your exam. This is figure 16.5. Remember, the goal of this countercyclical fiscal policy is going to be to smooth out fluctuations in the business cycle. So the blue line is just kind of the natural path of the economy without any policy. And the orange line is showing with that countercyclical fiscal policy that we're able to kind of make those jumps and, throws here not nearly as steep. Now, the multiplier, these are important. This is the one kind of new formula that you'll have this chapter. Because of multipliers, initial effects can theoretically snowball into further effects from policy. So what this implies is that the tools of fiscal policy are even more powerful than what we've indicated so far, because spending by one person becomes income for another, and this is true for private and government spending. Additionally, increases in income are typically going to lead to increases in consumption. The more income that you have, the more that you're likely to go out and spend. An increase in disposable income can either be saved or spent, but they're hoping that you'll go out and spend it. Now, remember that marginal propensity to consume. We've talked about this a little bit before, but this is just to kind of show you again. This is the amount of additional income that's going to be consumed with each increase. Today's post-Keynesian economists have come to the conclusion that over the long run, the marginal propensity to consume is approximately 0.9. So what that means is your marginal propensity to consume, or what you're likely to spend, is about 90% of what you make. Some notes here about this MPC. And this is another good slide to keep whenever you're working on your assignments as well. The multiplying effect is going to be significant whenever we focus on aggregate demand in the economy. Every time that somebody gets new income, they go out and spend part of it. That's just kind of the natural progression of things. After all the dust settles, the total impact is a multiple of the original spending that was created by the fiscal policy. So the initial $100 billion in government spending can increase total income by more than $100 billion. And what they're saying here is that because of that MPC, even though it's not constant across all people, that a policy of $100 billion can generate more than $100 billion of overall incomes. Okay, let me pop this slide up for you. Now, the MPC of the rich and the poor is different. It's not going to be the same for anybody in general, but between rich and poor people, it's a little bit different. Lower income people in countries that have a higher lower income people and also lower income countries are going to have higher MPC than their wealthier counterparts. The higher the income that you have typically will mean that your basic needs have already been met and that you're more likely to save additional income that you have for the future. The relationship this has to the multiplier is that if a stimulus package is introduced in the form of tax breaks with the goal to boost that aggregate demand, it's going to be more effective if it increases the income of people with a higher MPC or people that are more likely to spend that money. So basically, if you're giving people money with the hope that they'll spend their money, you want to give money to people that are more likely to spend the money. That's just kind of common sense there. And in most cases, that's going to be lower income people. And if you think about that, think about somebody that makes $1 million a year versus somebody that makes $20,000 a year. If the millionaire is given an extra $5,000, he's likely to just put that money in savings. Whereas if somebody that only makes $20,000 a year gets an extra $5,000, they're a lot more likely to go out and spend that money because they need it more. Their basic needs haven't necessarily been met properly, and they're going to go out and spend that money. So when you're trying to come up with these policies and you're trying to work on enacting them, you need to make sure that the right people are getting the money. Otherwise, you're just increasing the savings accounts of the wealthier population. So we're not going to watch this video, but as always, if you get curious about it, you can go ahead and send me an email. Nobody ever does, so that's fine. Not a big deal. This is figure 16.6. So the example on this slide assumes that our MPC is 0.75 and that government spending is increasing by $100 or $100 billion, sorry. You can see that we have our original AD1, the policy is enacted, and you can see we have our initial jump when the policy is enacted, and then these kind of residual leaps. So the aggregate demand curve is going to shift as the spending multiplies through the economy. And in the end, the total increase is going to be 4 times the initial change in the government spending, because the spending multiplier implied is the 0.75, which is going to be 4. So think about that for a second and see if you can kind of figure out where they've gotten that from. This isn't something that you'll be asked to calculate a lot, but it's important to kind of understand where that MPC is coming from. Now, if you're still lost, which most people are at this point, we're going to move on and look at the math of this. So we want to figure out the spending multiplier, or the total impact on spending from an initial amount. We have this MS is equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC. This is the new formula where we're using that MPC. We know in our previous example that MPC was 0.75, so we plug everything in. 1 over 1 minus 0.75 gives us 4, and that's how we know what that multiplier is. So go ahead and make a note. This is slide 25. Take a picture of it, make a mental note, whatever. But this is the formula that you'll need to be able to calculate what that spending multiplier is. And this is where you can kind of figure out what's going on. So if the MPC is 0.75, the overall effect of a single fiscal policy stimulus is going to be 4 times the size of the original amount. That's what this tells us. Okay, let's see. Oh, no, I did not mean to go that far. Y'all didn't see that answer. So if the MPC is 0.9, what will the total GDP impact be of $400 billion? And remember, that formula to figure out that multiplier is going to be 1 over 1 minus the MPC. And then once you calculate that, you multiply that times that original amount. So it is D. I hope you're saying that because you calculated it, not because I accidentally got a little trigger happy here with the space bar. But the way that we get that 4 trillion is you do 1 divided by 1 minus 0.9. So that's that spender or the multiplier formula, and we get 10. Then once you've calculated that 10, you go ahead and multiply that times 400 billion, and that's going to give you 4 trillion. So there's a lot of different zeros here, but it does break down to $4 trillion. Very good. And I see that you're putting that work in the comment section as well. So thank you for doing that. Very good. And this is kind of as extensive as the calculations do get for this chapter. So as long as you understand how to do that, then you'll be in great shape. So thank you, Eric. Really appreciate you putting that math in there. So some issues with fiscal policy. The question here that everyone has, and that a lot of people will debate about, is why doesn't government policy always work? Now, the 3 main reasons are time lags, crowding out, and savings adjustments. And we'll talk about more in depth what these things mean. But whenever we're trying to smooth out the business cycle or trying to recover from a recession, fiscal policy is not going to always work perfectly. So that's kind of an important consideration to keep in mind. So with time lags, we have kind of 3 main things here. Lagging basically means that for one reason or another, the impact of the policy can't instantly go out and fix the economy. So fiscal policy lags are generally going to be a lot longer than monetary policy lags, often because of the requirement for legislative approval. So sometimes recognition can be a problem. We don't even know we've had a recession until we're out of it. And also, the final revisions of that GDP data aren't released until about 3 months afterwards. So one bad quarter or one good quarter might not mean anything. We have to go ahead and get more of a long-term look at things. Changes in taxes and spending have to pass through both houses of Congress and the president. Think about that. We've already discussed it a little bit. That can be very time-consuming. Often, this is going to cause a greater delay than monetary policy. Now, some effects of lags. There's a risk of destabilization here. Expansionary policy may hit when the economy is already kind of rebounding and expanding, or on the other hand, contractionary policy can hit when the economy is starting to shrink. This could really exacerbate cycles rather than smoothing them out. And so the takeaway here is that lags can be pretty dangerous. It may cause policies to hit the wrong times, which causes damage instead of helping. And in implementation, this can be a problem. So remember, we just talked about the Stimulus Act of 2008. This was those tax rebate checks that went out to taxpayers. That passed in early February, but a lot of people didn't get checks until about 6 months later. And this delay occurred even though the recipients knew ahead of time. So this was an example of a lag, and that's kind of why that policy didn't work out very well. So we also have some automatic stabilizers. Excuse me, I can't talk today. These are useful because they're effective countercyclical policy measures that naturally occur. So for the most part, these are immune to recognition and implementation lags and political biases, and they remove some of the destabilization concerns. So some examples of these: progressive income tax rates. We know that the US has a progressive income tax system. What that means is that tax bills are going to fall when incomes fall during a recession and rise whenever incomes rise, which is an expansion. Corporate profit taxes, so lower total tax bills whenever your profits are lower. And on the other hand, bigger tax bills whenever you're making more money. Unemployment compensation is another automatic stabilizer. So this increases government spending automatically whenever the number of unemployed rises. Remember and think about what's going on now. They didn't have to pass a bunch of new laws and acts to be able to allow people to claim unemployment. That was something that was already in place, that's always in place, that allows people to go ahead and get that help when they need it, and also welfare programs. So whenever there's downturns happening, this allows the government to increase their spending and to help with welfare items. And on the other end, it decreases government spending when the economy is doing better and there's less people that need that help. So, which of the following is an automatic stabilizer? Very good. That correct answer is C, progressive income taxes. So, already there, already in place, and kind of naturally helps with everything. Now, crowding out. This means that government spending is sometimes just a substitute for private spending. This is going to reduce the ability of government spending to stimulate aggregate demand. So an example here, if the government increases government spending by paying for everybody's college tuition, you're no longer paying the tuition that you would have paid for anyway, and you might just save your money instead of going out and spending that money. So crowding out, basically private spending falls because the government spending has increased. Individuals go ahead and just save that money. They don't go out and spend it. They don't go out and spend that money somewhere else. And what that means is that this kind of policy might not cause overall spending to increase. It just increases the government's deficit and debt. Excuse me. Okay, so an example of crowding out. The fact that more people may save because of the higher interest rate can cause a decrease in the effectiveness of government spending. The government spent more, but you're spending less. So here, the government increases their spending by $100 billion. They borrowed the money, so somebody had to have saved the money for them to borrow it. You know, they sell those treasury bonds, whatever it may be. The demand increase for loans because of the government borrowing raises interest rates. People aren't going to take out as many loans if the interest rate's high. So there's a decrease in private spending, which is C, that's a direct result of the increase in government spending, G. They cancel each other out, and the policy does nothing except increase government debt. So this is just kind of showing that graphically. I'm not going to spend time on that today, but you can definitely look at it if you'd like on your own. Now, saving shifts are also something that can kind of cause policy to not work the way that we would think it would. So when individuals are making decisions about whether to save or to spend an increase in income, part of that decision is going to be based on whether or not they have to pay back the money in the future. Example being if the increase in your income was a loan. People perceive an increase in government spending as coming from borrowed funds, meaning that eventually we're going to have to pay them back in the future through higher taxes. And because of this, individuals are going to save more today to pay for tomorrow's taxes. And this can slow economic growth that the increase in government spending was designed to speed up. And you might have heard this or read articles about this, seen it on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, where people are, often saying that the government doesn't just give us money, right? Even if there's not a direct, you're going to pay back the stimulus check on your next taxes, which there's not in this case, everyone kind of knows that eventually taxes are going to increase to make up for that money that the government sent out. And this can cause some people to go ahead and just decrease their spending to go ahead and combat that future increase in taxes. And then it renders the policy pretty useless. This is just a good sample of all the different shortcomings of fiscal policy. Again, very good for your exam. It's slide 36 in your slides. And it just breaks down everything that was on the last 3 slides. So definitely make a note of that. It's very good for the exam if you're going to take it. It'll absolutely help you on your inquisitive. Just make a note and keep that handy. Now, supply-side fiscal policy, what we've discussed so far has been focused only on increasing or decreasing aggregate demand. Another kind of fiscal policy is going to target supply side. So supply-side fiscal policy, let me go ahead and pop the rest of the slide up for you, is the use of government spending and taxes to affect the supply side of the economy. Specifically, supply-side fiscal policy is going to try to increase long-run aggregate supply, so that vertical LRAS curve. And recall that the factors that increase this curve are going to be changes in resources, technology, and institutions. So technological advancement is going to allow for production of a greater quantity of output using the same or fewer resources. And in the long run, much economic growth is going to derive from technological advances. The government can also use tax code to encourage technological advancement. So a good example of this is since 1981, in the US, businesses have received tax credits for expenses that are related to research and development, so R&D spending. Because of this, firms that spend on research and development of new technology are going to pay lower taxes than those that don't. And this is a very significant incentive that encourages innovation and ultimately greater supply of output. So that's what's going on here. Now, to look at this graphically, our first click here is going to pull up our normal long-run aggregate supply curve with our aggregate demand curve. The goal of supply-side fiscal policy is to increase that long-run aggregate supply. So to increase innovation, technological progress, all of these things to allow our overall long-run supply to increase and jump over to the right. Some supply-side fiscal policy initiatives. Let me go ahead and pop all of these up for you. So research and development tax credits are going to give firms an incentive to spend resources on technological advancement. On number 2, policies that focus on education, so things like subsidies or tax breaks for education like Pell Grants. These create incentives to invest in education, increasing effective labor resources. On 3, lower corporate profit tax rates are going to provide increased incentives for corporations to undertake activities that are going to add more profits. And then on 4, lower marginal income tax rates are going to create incentives for individuals to work harder and produce more because you're going to be able to keep a larger share of your income. So the items on the list above on this slide are going to share 2 characteristics. Supply-side fiscal policy initiatives generally are going to focus on incentives for production. The idea here is that government frames many of the incentives within which people work and produce, and this is going to change these incentives to change production. Each of the proposals that we have on this list takes time to impact the aggregate supply. An example here, education subsidies may encourage people to go to college and learn some more skills that will help them in the workplace. But really, the full impact of these won't be felt until at least 4 years in the future, right? If you're just starting college as a freshman, they don't start to see those benefits in the labor force until you finish that 4-year degree. So it does take a lot of time to impact that supply side. Now, marginal tax rates, let me go ahead and pop this up for you. Taxes can increase or decrease government revenues. At low tax rates, obviously, increasing the rate will increase overall revenues. So if we go from a 0% income tax like we did in 1912 to positive tax rates in 1913, the government's starting to make some revenue here. If they want to maximize the revenues, they have to identify what's the optimal or correct income tax rate. Obviously, this is very difficult. So if the tax rate is too low or too high, revenues are going to be lower, because if the tax rate's too low, the government's not going to generate enough revenue. And if the tax rate's too high, people are going to work less and the overall tax base will shrink. You can imagine how hard it is to come up with what anyone would consider an optimal tax rate, because obviously, you know, we think that no taxes are optimal, but taxes are a necessary evil to make things run. So some marginal tax math here, not a new formula, just some ideas. Tax revenue depends on income and tax rates. At low tax rates, increasing tax rates going to increase overall tax revenues. If the rates are too high, increasing them further is going to decrease income and reduce your tax base. So why would income tax revenues fall when tax rates get too high? That's because there's a disincentive that's created for earning and reporting income. So in 1962, the top marginal tax rate was 91%. Think about that. 91% of your income would be taxed. That's a pretty good incentive to go ahead and hide any extra income that you're earning. The overall impact on tax revenue is going to depend on the degree to which income and tax rates are changing. So in other words, which is going to be the dominant effect in magnitude? This math kind of gives a prescription of what to do with tax rates if we want to increase revenue. The difficulty here is finding that cutoff between low tax rates and high tax rates. So some people are going to believe that we've never gotten to a point of high tax rates where increases in tax rates would decrease the overall revenue received by the government, but some people think that tax rates are always too high. So the effect here is really ambiguous, and there's not really like a straight, quantitative, perfect mathematical answer. It's all kind of trial and error. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this. There's just a quote that your book has from JFK, but we really don't need to read that today. Now, this is the Laffer curve. We have tax revenues on the y-axis. We have the tax rate on the x-axis. Obviously, T prime would be that optimal space where we're right in between region 1 and 2. Now, this is the graphical illustration of that relationship between tax rates and tax revenue. It helps us understand kind of how the tax rates are going to affect tax revenue, but a lot of economists are going to disagree on which tax rate T prime occurs. Like, they obviously all have different opinions. Now, region 1, this blue line, here increases in tax rates are going to lead to increases in tax revenue. The region is more intuitive and applies for all relatively low tax rates. Now, in region 2, you can see that increases in tax rates start to decrease tax revenue. Region 2 is going to apply to relatively high tax rates. And what it's saying here is that at higher rates, there's often going to be negative incentives for any activity that's taxed, meaning more people are incentivized to kind of lie about their income, to hide income and things like that. So finding this kind of prime area, it's very difficult. Almost every economist will disagree on where that area is. So it's really just a matter of trial and error. Now, politically, let's go ahead and pop all this up. Liberals are going to point out that the left side of the curve, this is what they like. The tax rate increases can lead to tax revenue increases, but they're very kind of, more on that end. Conservatives are going to point out the right side of the curve. They're going to believe that tax rate decreases are going to lead to tax revenue increases because the less taxes that are being paid, theoretically, the more people are willing to work harder and work more. So which side of the curve is more important, right? Well, both sides are equally important for economic policy. So this is obviously a very simplistic representation of political beliefs regarding taxes. Obviously, there's people that fall in every spectrum of the rainbow. The idea of this class, and hopefully any economics class that you ever take, is not to get political. I don't care what you believe politically, but I just want to point out to you kind of the basic, very simplified beliefs of each system, and then you can kind of use both of those to make your own assumptions. You don't have to fall strictly on one side or the other. You just have to kind of, do your research, figure out what you think is best. This is table 16.3. We're not really going to go over that because it's just kind of another example about taxes and revenues. So overall, fiscal policy, we know this is the use of government spending and taxes to influence the economy. Countercyclical fiscal policy, the goal is to smooth out that business cycle and to allow for less intense raises and contractions. Fiscal policy is not preferred because of lags, crowding out, and savings adjustments, meaning these are the shortcomings of fiscal policies. The higher that your MPC is, it means that your spending multiplier will be larger. Remember that poorer people are more likely to spend increases in their income than wealthier people. And then we looked at the Laffer curve, which shows that relationship between tax rates and tax revenues collected. So again, this chapter doesn't really introduce a lot of new math or any new groundbreaking concepts. It kind of just expands on what we've been working towards all semester. Obviously, with a lot of economic concepts, there aren't perfect answers. We have to kind of look at these things and try to just make the best decisions that we can based on historical data and the information that's available to us at the time. And there's never going to be a perfect solution. That's something that is very important, whether it's a Democratic president in office or a Republican president in office. The answers are never perfect. So just something to keep in mind. Please get those participation discussions finished up. I will get those exams and participation grades added today for exam 3. And then if you have any questions, the final exam review is already posted. If you plan on taking that exam, it's in the week 8 folder. But I'm around, and Thursday will be our last live stream meeting. So please make sure to attend on Thursday. Again, I really appreciate you guys participating. I really appreciate you taking the time to hop on these live streams. And I hope that you're staying safe and that you're having as good a time as is possible to have right now. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type those. Otherwise, feel free to email me, call me, whatever works best for you. And I will see you guys on Thursday. So thank you so much. Y'all have a great week. Eric, that sounds terrifying. I hope that everyone involved in that was all right. And remember, if you haven't registered for summer classes, please go ahead and do so. If you have any questions or you need any help, just let me know. I do have an accounting principles class this summer that's offered as a night class that will obviously be online now, but I promise you we will not be online for the full 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. 2 nights a week. It will be much shorter than that. So if you need accounting, let me know. I can help you get registered for that. If you need something else and you're not sure how to get there, please let me know, and I will absolutely be happy to help you with that. And yes, I agree, Eric, that people need to learn to slow down and be a little bit more careful when they're driving. So you guys stay safe, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you again.